How silence became a political weapon. No law was passed, no force was used, and no announcement was made. Nothing appeared to change. And that was the point. This story matters today because power does not always expand by speaking louder. Sometimes it grows by saying less, allowing uncertainty, fear, and assumption to do the work instead. The effectiveness of silence as a political tool depends on the gap between what people need to know and what they are told. The wider that gap, the more power silence accumulates, because uncertainty fills the void with compliance, caution, and self-censorship. At the time, the country faced rising tension, public anxiety, and questions leaders were unwilling or unable to answer directly. Rather than confront the uncertainty, those in power chose restraint, limiting information, delaying statements, and avoiding clarity. The choice was strategic rather than accidental. Direct statements create accountability. They can be quoted, challenged, and measured against outcomes. Silence creates none of these vulnerabilities. Silence was framed as responsibility. Waiting was described as caution. Absence of explanation was presented as stability. Each framing served to normalize the absence of information by attaching positive values to it. Responsibility, caution, and stability are all qualities that populations associate with good governance, and by linking them to silence, leaders made the withholding of information appear not just acceptable but virtuous. At first, this approach seemed harmless. Without confirmation, people filled gaps with optimism, assuming nothing was wrong because nothing was said. The initial public response to silence was benign, even supportive. People interpreted the absence of alarming information as evidence that nothing alarming was occurring. This interpretation required no effort and produced no anxiety, making it the path of least psychological resistance. But silence shapes perception. It controls narrative by removing reference points, forcing citizens to interpret reality without guidance. When official information is withheld, every individual must construct their own understanding of events from whatever fragments are available. This fragmentation of understanding serves power by preventing the formation of a unified public interpretation that might challenge the official position, whatever that position might be. As questions went unanswered, debate slowed, criticism softened, and accountability blurred. The mechanics of democratic accountability depend on a cycle of action, explanation, and evaluation. When explanation is removed from the cycle, evaluation becomes impossible. Citizens cannot hold leaders accountable for positions that were never stated, decisions that were never explained, or intentions that were never declared. Power did not advance through action, but through quiet. This was the moment when silence stopped being neutral and started becoming a weapon. As silence continued, uncertainty began doing the work that policy usually performs, shaping behavior through assumption rather than instruction. Without clear statements, institutions hesitated, media speculated cautiously, and opposition struggled to respond to positions that were never formally stated. The opposition's dilemma was structural. Effective opposition requires something to oppose. When power operates through silence, the opposition must either respond to an absence, which appears paranoid, or wait for a statement, which may never come. The absence of answers created space where authority could shift without confrontation, because nothing concrete existed to challenge. The informational vacuum that silence created was not empty. It was filled with the assumptions, fears, and calculations of everyone operating within it. Those assumptions consistently favored caution, because acting boldly in the absence of information carries greater perceived risk than acting cautiously. Citizens adjusted their expectations downward, avoiding questions that seemed pointless and debates that led nowhere. The learned helplessness that extended silence produces is one of its most powerful effects. When people repeatedly seek information and receive none, they eventually stop seeking. The reduction of public inquiry is not the same as public satisfaction, but it looks identical from the outside. Silence reduced accountability by removing moments of record, leaving no promises to measure and no commitments to contest. The absence of a formal record is not merely an administrative gap, it is a strategic advantage. Accountability requires evidence, and silence produces none. Leaders who say nothing cannot be quoted saying the wrong thing. Over time, this quiet approach normalized delay, making inaction appear deliberate and restraint seem strategic. What once felt temporary became routine, as ambiguity settled into governance like policy without text. The routinization of silence transformed it from a tactic to a culture. New officials who entered government inherited the culture of silence without necessarily understanding its origins, perpetuating it not through strategic calculation, but through institutional habit. The buildup was subtle, because nothing provoked outrage, only fatigue. Power accumulated not by enforcement, but by erosion of engagement. And the longer silence held, the harder it became to break. The conflict emerged when silence stopped calming uncertainty and began intensifying it, as unanswered questions turned into suspicion rather than patience. Public trust weakened because people could no longer tell whether restraint meant caution or concealment. The ambiguity that had initially been interpreted as prudence was now interpreted as evasion. The same silence that had once reassured now alarmed, as accumulated experience taught the public that important information was being withheld rather than simply delayed. Opposition voices fractured, unsure how to respond to power that refused to define itself clearly. The lack of a clear target for criticism divided opposition groups into those who focus on the silence itself and those who focus on the assumed content behind it. This division weakened collective action and dispersed energy. Institutions filled the vacuum inconsistently, creating uneven enforcement and selective clarity that favored those already in control. In the absence of clear central guidance, individual institutions developed their own interpretations of policy, creating a patchwork of practice that varied by location, agency, and connection to power. The buildup accelerated when a major issue demanded explanation, yet silence persisted, signaling that accountability was optional. The failure to address a matter of clear public significance when public expectation demanded address transformed silence from a passive posture into an active provocation. What had once avoided confrontation now created it, as ambiguity exposed how much authority had shifted without consent. Silence had become asymmetric, protecting power while disarming challenge. The country reached a point where absence of information felt more threatening than bad news. This was the moment when quiet governance revealed its true cost, and the weaponized silence could no longer remain invisible. The climax arrived when silence finally collapsed under the weight of its own ambiguity, forcing the country to confront how much power had shifted without a single declaration. What once felt like restraint was now recognized as control exercised without accountability. The resolution lies in understanding that silence is never empty in politics. When leaders refuse to speak, they allow uncertainty to govern, shaping outcomes without taking responsibility for them. This story matters today because silence remains one of the most effective tools of modern power, quieter than force, harder to resist, and easier to normalize. What is not said can decide as much as what is declared. History shows that transparency is not noise, it is protection. When explanation disappears, consent soon follows. Power does not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it wins simply by waiting for everyone else to stop asking. Subscribe to join the journey. How